Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's finally time for the year-end list. So, 2025 has been a pretty terrible decade. Though as beyond exhausting as these past 12 months have been in so many different ways, both in terms of the world at large and on a personal level, as I've been balancing this channel with a new day job that's given me less and less time to actually work on videos. I'm at least happy to have come out on the other end still breathing. I managed to survive putting together 3 2-hour Some Stuff I Missed roundups, a run of 5 different videos all in 1 week for this channel's 10-year anniversary I recorded while simultaneously fighting bizarre, inexplicable bouts of vertigo, a collection of 10 retrospective year-end lists for the entire 90s decade which I threw together in 2 days total for a sub-milestone, and a Drexia Odds and Ends video, which was the hardest to get through of them all. That one very nearly killed me. Oh yeah, and I finally finished and released a new album myself. It's been a pretty crazy year on a personal level. I suspect I'm going to have to further slow down my uploads in 2026 to be able to make more room for things that aren't my day job or this channel, which almost felt like the only things I had time for this year. But I'm still going strong with this channel anyway and still enjoying it, so not to worry, I'm definitely not going to be stopping anytime soon. And as for the state of electronic music as a genre, you may have already put together how I feel given the title and expanded length of this video, but 2025 has been an absolutely incredible year for electronic music. One of the very best years for the genre in recent memory. I may not have given out any 9 out of 10s to albums while I was reviewing them, but I have given out so ridiculously many 8 out of 10s that I couldn't keep this list contained to just a top 10 like I usually do. The sheer quantity of great electronic music has been more up there with years like 1997 than it has even with more recent standout years for the genre like 2013 or 2020. Now, the vast majority of it has been very underground and the result of my escalating addiction to random Bandcamp diving. With the mainstream having kind of ceased to exist, tech companies attempting to replace every major artistic medium with AI slop, and the infrastructure by which any real art reaches an audience having continued to collapse, it's been harder and harder for artists to be able to break their name through. If you're not as in the weeds with this genre as I am, you could be forgiven for thinking the only electronic releases of note this year were Skrillex, Nina Girachi, and Oneohtrix Point Never. Or maybe you didn't even hear about those releases either, who knows? You might have heard that and wondered what the hell even is a Nina Girachi. Those albums did not make the cut for this list. But that makes it all the more important for me to shout out as many underground names as I can, and it helps that all of my top 20 this year and even several of my honorable mentions would have easily made my top 10 had they come out last year. And the actual ranking is barely pinned down at all. I've had a good idea of what my top 4 is going to be for a long time, though pretty much anything else in the top 20 could have had a shot for like taking the number 5 spot in a less historically stacked year. I may as well have like a 12-way tie or something. Not to mention, the sheer amount of projects I had in rotation led to all of them getting a roughly equal amount of replay value. So yeah, I wouldn't take the rankings themselves that seriously this year. Everything I'll be talking about today gets as high a recommendation from me as any other year-end list placement from other years would be. So let's finally get into it. Here's the usual disclaimers that this is all just my opinion and you can feel free to disagree with it. None of this list is set in stone. You know the usual drill by now. Let's just talk about some great electronic music. This is the top 20 best albums of 2025. So before we start the top 20, I still got a sizable list of honorable mentions on top of that, so let's get through those first. Honorable mention number 1, The Black Dog, Loud Ambient. Just for the record, this is the exact spot on the list I was already planning to put this album in before I heard the news, but holy shit, R.I.P. to Ken Downey. I don't feel like I have the words to fully express how much the Black Dog's music has meant to me over pretty much my entire adult life. I'll be honest, I'd almost started to take them for granted a little bit, especially over the last couple of years with their output having sped up so significantly. I felt like their continuing to put out quality ambient and techno music had just become a self-evident fact of life. In my last couple of videos on them, including the review I did of this album only just over a month ago, I was even talking about how I was running out of unique things to say about their work. So, hearing this news was legit devastating in a way that very few high-profile deaths in the music world would be. I don't know what's going to happen with the Black Dog going forward, but whether Martin and Richard choose to stop here or keep going as a duo, I suspect the latter, given I feel like Martin has been the one primarily steering the ship in more recent years anyway, though I don't know. With Loud Ambient marking the end of an era and being the final Black Dog album to include contributions from Ken Downey, at least said era definitely went out on a comparative high note. Loud Ambient may just be a regular old traditional ambient techno album with no twists, but not only was it one of their tightest albums ever with just 10 tracks adding up to about 45 minutes total and no skips or filler, it was also an uncharacteristically pleasant, feel-good listen. The melodies were much brighter and more welcoming on average than the dark and foreboding tone I had come to expect out of them. And it was one of their most easily replayable projects in quite a while as well. It's my second favorite project to come out of this most productive recent era of theirs behind My Brutal Life 2 years ago. I would have still been recommending this just as highly for anyone who wanted their traditional ambient techno fix in 2025, even if Downey was still with us. And yeah, regardless of what happens for the Black Dog next, I just want to say thank you to these guys for all of the good stuff they've put out and how much of an unignorable presence they've been in my listening habits over all these years. Honorable mention number 2, Bandler King, Mercurial. Next up, this has been a particularly strong year for electronic jazz crossovers, though while this was one that really only got into my rotation in the beginning of the year and didn't stay there for long, coming back to it now, it still holds up as great as it did when I reviewed it, and it definitely has a feel to it that no other album I heard this year did in the same way. This Belgian trio delivered probably the most electronic-centric of these electronic jazz crossovers, balanced those influences more equally than any other artist I heard this year, both with solid live jazz chops, as well as a solid understanding of the electronic frameworks they're playing within and what makes those genres work. Adding jazzier elements to various wonky bass music and dubstep-adjacent instrumentals that would hit well even without the jazzy flares, landing somewhere between The Comet Is Coming and electro-hip-hop acts such as Pretty Lights, with a lot of interesting variety in grooves and influences along the way, both heavy bangers and more chill emotional stuff. It may not have gotten as much replay value as I thought it would earlier in the year, but it's still great, so definitely make sure to still check it out. Honorable mention number 3, Lighter, Weird.Fishes. Next up, here's probably my favorite purely ambient release I heard this year. Just barely missed the cut for making the list proper. Super well-textured stuff, and so many different sounds and variety in instrumentation floating through these mixes. The synths range from comforting and melodic to strange and experimental. Some moments feel like they call back to like the 90s FSOL Lifeforms era, where while maybe a few others call back to synth ambience of the 70s, there's also accompaniment from not just wordless vocal textures, but also saxophones and violins. For the complete lack of structure this thing has, it's a very consistently fascinating listen. Really nice stuff. And on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, honorable mention number 4, Slickback, Attrition. Next up, this one's for those who just want some crazy experimental bass music bangers, and very few albums I heard in 2025 banged quite like this one did. This admittedly isn't an album that I was necessarily coming back to a lot this year, but I was thinking about it more than I expected to as other artists in similar veins came along, and I realized that this was probably my favorite project I heard out of this particular scene. There may be very little in the way of tunes here, but the way all of these textures are twisted into so many different interesting shapes is consistently investing, and the production carries an absolutely insane level of heaviness and weight with bass that can absolutely crush you, but not to the point of cutting into the other details in the mix. The more times I do come back to it, the more it grows on me, so yeah, gotta be highlighting this as a standout of the year for the niche it fills. Honorable mention number 5. Etienne de Crécy, Warm Up. Next, who should show up this year but one of the OG pioneers of French house and French touch, delivering one of his once-a-decade appearances that kinda combines everything that worked about all his previous super discount records at once. Primarily an electropop and new disco record designed for easy mainstream adjacent digestibility like Super Discount 2 and 3, but also vaguely combining it with the classy chillness of the very first Super Discount. And it all comes together really smoothly without feeling watered down. I would totally get it if other people found this one to be too bland and poppy for their liking, but the hooks and melodies were so consistently strong and well constructed for me that I ended up keeping the whole thing around and coming back to it semi-regularly throughout the year without ever getting sick of it. And for this kind of sugary pop music to do that isn't easy. While something like, say, Knit's Big Bang Puzzle last year could hit the same kind of fluffy French synth pop note with more substance, flavor, and creativity, with that album I definitely got into a point where I wore it into the ground and didn't have the same fun listening to it anymore, while this held up the same amount every time I put it on. And sure, being in a way more stacked year, preventing it from getting the same kind of personal overexposure as the Knit thing, that helped. But I can also give credit to this album being much better structured and sequenced too. There may not be much to warm up, but the consistency with which it lived up to its title throughout the year and the amount of mileage I've gotten out of it has to be commended. I can definitely still recommend giving it a shot if you missed it yourself. Honorable mention number 6. Birdsnake, Biofilter. One of the more last-minute additions to the list, and very nearly scraped into the bottom of the top 20 proper, here's an Australian outfit delivering some of the most organic-sounding blends of down-tempo, ambient, dub, and techno influences, widely sonically varied with lots of bubbling aquatic synths and pads, kalimbas and vibraphones and saxophones and hand percussion, filtered through spacey beatwork both in minimal lo-fi hip-hop adjacent frameworks as well as more driving dub techno a la Deep Chord, or other more expansive 90s IDM influenced arrangements. Other albums here had better tunes or could hit on deeper emotional levels, but this was one of the most immersive and well-textured listening experiences I had this year. And once again, it's going super overlooked, so give it a shot if that sounds like your bag. Honorable mention number 7. Kane, Lineage. And if you want a halfway point between my previous two picks, here's one that came from a Scottish producer who once worked as a professional bagpiper and combined his talents in that field with a surprisingly well-varied blend of sparkling and striking organic house arrangements that brought in influences not just from traditional Scottish and Celtic music, but also some Latin and tropical influences, and some like Middle Eastern, Indian, or even African influences as well, and they all fit better alongside each other than you would expect. This project didn't sound quite like anything else I heard this year. The wide variety of textures from all over the world, also how clean and well polished the production is, and how those influences still make for easily accessible and sticky melodic hooks, really captivated my attention and stuck in my memory. This also went pretty under the radar, so make sure to give it a try if that sounds like it'd be your thing. Honorable mention number 8. Matmos, Metallic Life Review. Next, I gotta give a shout out to Matmos. This album may not have been the kind of thing that got a ton of replay value out of me this year. Matmos albums rarely do to begin with. But anytime I did put this one on, I was like, oh yeah, I did really like this one. This was their album made entirely out of found samples of metallic objects, as a spiritual successor to their album made entirely out of plastic objects. And I felt like this hit a similar balance for me as Plastic Anniversary of feeling creative with its sound design and retaining the wilder experimentalism present on all Matmos records, but also making it more approachable than usual and bringing in some more tuneful melodic compositions. Like, bells are made of metal, so those make for a good texture to bring in. And the whole thing's so tactile and micro-detailed too, as so many of my favorite IDM records can be. So yeah, this was one of their best in quite a while. Enough so where I felt like it deserved a mention here. Honorable mention number 9, Sofia Cortesi's Volver EP. Now, in terms of just regular old commercial deep house, I think this EP was probably the biggest highlight of the year for me, and quite handily the one I came back to the most frequently. I generally liked Sofia Cortesi's debut album 2 years ago, but I didn't really get what all the hype was about. This EP, meanwhile, felt like a level up for her across the board, with even catchier tunes and punchier grooves and better variety, from like some Latin pop influence stuff, to some new disco, to some piano-driven Italo house kind of stuff, to even one track with I think some African influence, kind of making similar moves to what Disclosure did with their excellent Ecstasy EP years ago. It's super immediate and super replayable. I made like a mini album out of adding my 2 favorite tracks from Madres to the end of this EP, and I've been spinning that regularly since. So yeah, if you, like me, were not convinced by her hype before, this was the moment where I felt like she started really living up to it. Great stuff all around. Honorable mention number 10, 8-2 Lentina, Surpassing Disaster. Finally, this year's been good for experimental ambient and or techno projects bringing in varied instrumentation from all over the world. But here's one if you want some more specifically on the darker and more serious side, taking lots of influence from Arab orchestral music, and shaping it into all sorts of different interesting arrangements, from off-kilter dark ambience, dub-inspired vocal echoing, tribal beatwork, some slightly more aggressive bass music influenced stuff, and more. It's giving Muslim Gauze vibes, but with more tightly controlled structures on average, instead of more open-ended jam sessions. The album is still very front-loaded for me, with a less interesting second half, and that 8-minute centerpiece track with the half-spoken, half-screamed adaptation of an Asada Shakur poem is still kind of jarring and off-putting for me to, listen to, even if I very much appreciate what it represents conceptually, especially with how unfortunately timely it ended up becoming in the wake of Asada Shakur's passing. But yeah, even with my minor issues, this was an album that I kept thinking about and stuck in my mind. It's a pretty fascinating listen, and I definitely think it's going to be worth hearing and deserves more attention. Honorable mention number 11, 256 Pi, Real Life and Postcard Use. Couldn't resist. It's been a while since I've gotten to do this joke. But hey, for once an album I made myself has been getting actual acclaim from other people, and even fellow music review channels, rather than me just doing self-promo. I made it nearly halfway up Ryan from Not Real Music's year-end list. He's one of the goats of music recommendations, so you don't have to take my word for it. Go check it out if you haven't already. Support your boy. Anyway, that's going to be it for the honorable mentions, but having covered over 120 projects this year, mostly through my Some Stuff I Missed roundups, even that only scratches the surface of the amount of quality I heard this year, so as has become the tradition, I'll also be shouting out a bunch of my favorite individual tracks from albums I think are also worth hearing. And there were so astoundingly many to mention that I'm gonna have to do this in 2 chunks. I'll do half here and the other half when I get through half of the main list. So, there we go. Going alphabetically by artist. gonna stop there for now and pick it up later, but now it's time to get into the list proper. Number 20. Rum Pistol Nebula. Alright, to start the list off, here we got an electronic jazz crossover from none other than Rum Pistol, who's now become a pretty regular fixture of my listening rotation. It is lower on the list, if only because there are certain moments from here I come back to a fair bit more than others, namely the opener Ascension, the track Above the Horizon, and Pale Blue Dot. I do think the album's first half is stronger than its second half. But still, anytime I was doubting whether this album was worthy of inclusion on the list, I remembered, oh yeah, this is the same guy who made Dynamo and After the Flood, an artist known for otherwise more low-key and pleasant blends of IDM and more recently big emotional heavy-hitter modern classical records, now making a big swing towards working with a live jazz ensemble and combining that sound with influences from synth artists of the 70s like Tangerine Dream and the like to make his most cosmic and epic work to date inspired by the space race. Even putting aside the daring change in sound and approach, this was an album that felt pretty well designed to appeal to my sensibilities specifically as a fan of cosmic electronic jazz crossovers like this. And it is definitely one of my most frequently listened to albums of the year, continuing to show this guy's talents for instrumental arrangement and compositions that really hit on an emotional level. It's not Isola, but it's clearly not trying to be either, and I have all the respect not only for how he's continued to evolve and try new things, but how well he executed this particular blend of influences. This album was properly great all the same, and I'm definitely excited to see wherever he'll be heading next. Number 19. Shirax's Proof of Life. To give you another good idea on how stacked this year was, here's an album that's not only been in consistent rotation since near the beginning of the year, but was also taking my number 1 album of the year spot for a very brief period around March. Even if other, even better things came in afterwards, I gotta give credit to this small-time St. Louis-based experimental sound collage artist for really catching me off guard with their most accessible work yet, combining influences of psychedelia, shoegaze, breakbeat, folk, vaporwave, drum and bass, and more. At the time I reviewed it, I compared it to artists like Bent, Sweet Trip, Early Seafeel, Haunted Disco, even the Avalanche's Wildflower came to mind a little bit in certain specific moments. And I hadn't been expecting that, considering this artist has, again, mostly been operating within the experimental ambient sound collage space, mashing together samples in really strange and out-of-the-box ways that, while fairly lo-fi and rough around the edges, didn't seem quite like any other artists I'd come across, like trying to set up semi-alien world building through sonic scrapbooking. But while this album is just as lo-fi and DIY feeling as all their other work, I was really surprised by how tuneful it was and how strong the melodies were across the board. It's a lot more warm and welcoming and comforting than the darker and more mysterious mixes I was introduced to their work through albums like Colors, Tease, and Ecdysis, while retaining those albums' more organic edges. Perhaps other albums on this list might improve upon certain individual facets to what I liked in this album, with more impressive production values. But this is still the only album that combines these influences together in this very specific way, and the results were more than charming and replayable enough to earn a year-end list placement somewhere. And once again, this artist is going extremely overlooked, and I think deserves plenty more attention than they're getting, so definitely make sure to give this one a shot if you haven't. Damn it! Well, you'll definitely want to make sure to give that one a shot if you haven't heard of it. Number 18. Marconi Union, The Fear of Never Landing. Next up, here's a name I sure wouldn't have been expecting to show up on one of these lists. I've generally enjoyed what I've heard of Marconi Union's music before. They're quite good at making very warm and enveloping ambient music with occasional post-rock touches, and if I'd heard their Ghost Stations album when it came out in 2016, that probably could have gotten a shout on my year-end list that year. But on average, I have always found their work to feel very plain and not stand out to me much in the greater scheme of the genre. Still, I gotta give credit where credit is due. The Fear of Neverlanding is one of their very best works to date. A completely seamless blend of 9 tracks ranging from serene emotional ambience to propulsive synth arpeggios, going up against expansive cinematic pads and guitars, with each track adding its own spin on the same themes, but all clearly meant to be digested as a single cohesive piece with how tightly constructed its continuous mix is. Tracks building up and paying off in satisfying ways, not just within their own lengthy running times, but between each other as well. This really was an impressive work that, while sticking to the kinds of styles you'd expect out of this band, hit me a lot more immediately than I ever would have expected, and I think I'm even willing to call it their second best album overall behind Ghost Stations. Beautiful stuff. Number 17. DJ Dance Alone, Acceptance. Next up, here's my favorite album I heard from the $10 tier of my Patreon page. Shout out to Stanley Like Cyan for being a close runner-up and making a better The Orb album than The Orb did this year. But yeah, this one definitely stuck with me a fair bit longer than I thought it would after I first heard it. DJ Dance Alone may be responsible for my favorite $10 Patreon request I've ever gotten, with his 2021 album Memphis Innovation under the Dakuan name. Although the album he came out with this year, while clearly recognizable as the same guy, also has a completely different appeal. Playing with classic Detroit techno and UK garage adjacent frameworks and sound palettes, and turning them upside down and inside out to create something way crazier and more out there experimental than anything else I'd heard from him previously. Twisting those old synths and sampling styles into intentionally off-putting and unconventional shapes, and even sticking in a bunch of experimental noise interludes in the mix. All adding up to an experience meant to be symbolic of the horror of watching fascism take over the entire country, coming to terms with this new reality and how we'll have to all continue to survive. This album did take a long time to really grow on me. I had no idea what to make of it on first listen, but the more times I put it on, the more layers I felt like I was unpeeling with it, and the more its overall vision made cohesive sense, and the more each random twist and turn felt like it served its own purpose. I already landed on it being really good when I reviewed it, and it's only grown on me even more since then, to the point where I now do think it is properly great. I don't know how easy it'll be to recommend to everyone, but I know my audience likes a challenging listen every now and then, and if you're game for that, then I think there's a lot of substance and clever ideas ready to unpack here. Really cool stuff, and once again, really deserves to get more attention as well. Number 16. Clara, Remember This Body. Okay, so this one is technically qualified as an EP, although given it is about 40 minutes total, I decided it is close enough to a regular album to count towards the list anyway. It is not even the shortest entrant into the list proper. Also, the experience I got from this project either way wasn't quite like anything else I heard this year, and I thought it was worth the extra shout out. This is some of the absolute cleanest production I've heard out of any release at all this year. The textures on this one feel so imposing and high resolution, but also kind of subtle and maybe even cinematic feeling at the same time. The 5 tracks on here sound completely different from each other, from the liquid experimental bass music banger of Conundrum, to the heavy and propulsive tribal beatwork of Betcha Wouldn't Hurt Me and Tumble Turn, to the epic 17-minute centerpiece There's Nothing Happening Between Us, evolving between tense ambience and banging techno and back and into new places, to the laid-back soul-sampling finale, Just Can't Live Without You. But all these tracks still form a satisfying emotional arc and fit together really well. These are some synth mixes that both feel very metallic and sleek, but also like they're coming to life and gaining sentience in front of you or something. It's super impressive. You're not going to want to miss this one if you can help it. Number 15. Psi Cubed, 6-Dimensional Space. Next up, here was the album I picked up the most frequently this year when I was in need of my 90s new age throwback fix. OPN hit the spot well too, but I think this guy did it better, creating loads of spacey, down-tempo synth arrangements that feel like they could fit perfectly at home, scoring water levels in old PS2-era platformers, but also the whole 6-dimension concept proved to be pretty interesting in execution as well. Each of the 16 tracks being labeled with one of 6 prefixes in Chinese to denote which dimension they come from, and each of those dimensions feel like they have their own unique feel, from 70s inspired synth ambience to stuff that brings in more Asian influences and woodwinds and stuff, to some moody trip-hop influenced stuff, to even a couple of crunchy breakbeat bangers. It's legit some pretty neat and imaginative musical world building that makes the album quite dense and well varied, and while I initially found the experience to be a slight bit on the overlong side and not pace itself as well as it could, I found those criticisms mattering less and less to me, and the more I felt like I was just unpeeling further layers and exploring new facets to it. So yeah, really impressive stuff that's kept me coming back. Go check it out. Number 14. Reed Willis, Reliquary. I'd already been a Reed Willis fan before, what with him having made my number 1 favorite album of 2023 and all, but 2025 was the year I really got into his work when I did my video on this album, including the full and brief segment, and I realized I enjoyed all of his albums on a comparable level and found his evolution over the years to be pretty fascinating. And while this latest offering from him, Reliquary, may not have been quite on the level of a home run that Sediment was to me, it was still amazing. Feels like it could act as an effective mirror and companion to what I loved so much in that project, but also is able to stand on its own as one of Willis's darker efforts overall. When I started writing this list, I was half expecting this album to be closer to the bottom of the top 20, mainly since I returned to one specific track from it way more than any of the other tracks here, that obviously being the 10-minute penultimate climax, I Am a Forest Fire, which I think might be my favorite individual track of the entire year, full stop. Also the ambient piano closer in Endless Path Ascending. I usually let that one play out too, and it's gorgeous as well. I didn't come back to the first 8 tracks quite as often, but while working on this video and really sitting with the rest of the album, I was reminded of how well all of that was hitting too, and still nailing his dark, symphonic, electronic IDM style in plenty of different ways that all fit seamlessly together. Tracks like Mutual Fun and Diamond Spitter, the kinda hip-hop influenced vocal chops on Underpunish, and the kinda more light and positive toned Sincerio are other standouts of note. Had me wondering why I wasn't just putting the whole thing on front to back more often. But yeah, Reed Willis continues to be an absolute legend either way. Nobody makes stuff quite like he does, and he's rapidly becoming one of my favorite breakout underground artists in the 2020s. I can recommend this just as much as anything else he's made. Number 13. CFAX Acid Crew, Slam Zone. And speaking of legends continuing to kill it as always, we of course gotta mention CFAX bringing another round of his biggest rave and acid bangers yet. This album may not be as well sequenced or structured as his 2021 masterpiece Box Steady. It takes a while to really get going for me, but there's just as many high points here. See the pummeling industrial acid techno of Slamuel Beppies, the early orbital-esque waltz acid 2, the shouting irreverence of What the Facts, the Pac-Man themed acid and breakbeats combo of Factory Reset, and the bright and soul-lifting melodies of what's probably my favorite track, Life World, just to name a few highlights. though all the tracks sit in their own ways, and even that somewhat slower first quarter has grown on me over time too. At the end of the day, absolutely no one can make retro dance music as infectious and immediately easy to love and groove along to like CFAX can, and his newest stuff is continuing to cement itself as his most essential work. This was another home run for him, and he was such a no-brainer that his placement on this list may as well have already been decided the second I saw this album's title show up in my inbox. But while we're on the topic of legends in the retro dance and acid field putting out some of their best work, number 12, Wagon Christ, Planet Roll. And here was me thinking Luke Vibert had just settled into his established legacy status with his biggest classics behind him. Planet Roll, his first album under the Wagon Christ name in several years, I was expecting to be more fairly standard acid bangers in his usual bag, and not much more than that. And I was completely blindsided to hear a wild and creative combination of like every single one of his influences he's ever explored in all the 30 plus years he's been on the scene. Primarily working with the punchy sample-based instrumental hip-hop frameworks that the best classic Wagon Christ albums like Throbbing Pouch and Tally Ho were built around, but combining them with all of his retro dance throwbacks from 90s rave, to 80s electro, to acid, to house, to drum and bass, and everything in between. Every track is so full of life and energy, even in the slowest moments, and with quirky and goofy vocal snippets being thrown at you every few seconds to even further hype you up. It's so dense and sprawling and yet also so consistently investing. No major skips either, even if it might lose a little steam at the very end. It's easily the best thing he's put out in years, near impossible to put on without cracking a smile. Number 11, Skirkin, Not. This was probably the hardest album to figure out where exactly it belonged in the ranking. It was anywhere from near the bottom of the top 20 to approaching the top 5 depending on the listen, but I landed right around the halfway point. This album is some absolutely gorgeous cinematic synth material with influences from garage and techno, but also some jazz and classical thrown in there as well. And while it is also an album that starts a lot better than it ends, it's also pretty well varied as well, and there's very little redundancy in the track listing or moments where it ever feels like things are running together. Tracks can focus on some simpler and icier ambient techno grooves, but also some much more propulsive and dark mixes. Some tracks can strip themselves back, and others just pack in so much expansive instrumental detail that even calling it movie soundtrack worthy feels like selling it short. And the melodies and emotional resonance are super on point as well. The whole project is dedicated to the late Arnie Grettar, aka Futuregrapher, who shocked much of the ambient world with his far too early passing earlier this year. And one track on this thing is even named after that guy's self-managed label, Moatun 7. If you're a fan of artists like John Hopkins and you have been missing the more well-textured and expansive banger side of that guy's sound, I think you're really gonna want to hear this one. Gonna have to check out more of this guy's work at some point soon, but in the meantime, this is some beautiful stuff and absolutely worth going out of your way to hear. Alright then, we're at the halfway point of the list, so that means it's time for the other half of my list of individual song shoutouts. So let's get back into those, the other half of the alphabet.
to the future.
Alright, and that's going to be it for individual song shoutouts. So now, let's get into the top 10 proper. Number 10. Yarny Anemoya.
You've got me thinking a little bit differently than I normally do.
Okay, I'll be honest and say it is really pushing it genre-wise to include this album on a list of the best electronic albums of the year. It's much closer to neo-soul, jazz, and disco with not much in the way of synths. But I decided to include it anyway, since A, this artist has an electronic background, having come up in the deep house scene before evolving into this soul and jazz direction over time. Seeing as I once marked From the Sea by Michael Menner and the Pretty Fantastics as my favorite album of 2018, this feels like it qualifies under my format equally as much as that. And B, once again, it is getting criminally overlooked. In a just world, this could be getting the same kind of mainstream adjacent exposure as artists like Jessie Ware or Loive, but it's instead coming from a small-time, self-released house producer from Sheffield without those kinds of industry connections. Someone needs to be highlighting an album like this in a list like this, so that may as well be me. Anyway, if it wasn't obvious, this album is amazing, probably my favorite work Yarny has put out to date. The production is absolutely gorgeous, so much lush instrumental blends bringing in horns, strings, keyboards, live drums, and funk guitars, along with the occasional synths. It's clear an absolute ton of work went into assembling all the live musicians and their performances, as well as the mixing and mastering. The whole thing is meant to evoke the same kinds of feelings that Yarny's favorite records from the 70s instilled in him, and the result is so incredibly sunny and uplifting as to be able to make the dead of winter feel like a beautiful summer day. And once again, there's no skips. A decent amount of variety too, from jazzier cuts to soul and trip-hop ballads to up-tempo disco-y cuts with sticky melodic hooks, and it's incredibly easy to connect with right on the surface. Not nearly enough people are talking about this one. It is an absolute must-listen, if you ask me. Number 9. Khadija Al-Hanafi. Okay. You know, back when I reviewed this album, I thought it was really solid, a collection of 20 light and silly footwork and juke banger fragments, with some occasional jazzy sampling and amusing vocal snippets interjecting throughout, saying stuff like, "Eat that pussy, eat that ass," or "Look at the swag, lip gloss jackass," or auto-tuning a literal crying baby. I thought it was a fun time, kind of in a similar vein to that Susie analog thing I really liked last year, and figured I could keep it around, though I wasn't sure whether it would stick with me longer term. Anyway, fast forward to now, and this is almost certainly my single most replayed album of the entire year. It has some competition, and there's other albums I know I've spent more total time with due to their being significantly longer, but none that got more replays by quantity, between getting a head start early in the year and just continuing to stick without me ever getting sick of it. Whenever I would just need a low-stakes fun time, I would frequently just give this one another spin and watch as the next half hour would zip by in an instant, and it would just keep hitting every time. So many catchy hooks and cool sample flips throughout this thing that keep it feeling substantive despite its length, and that short running time makes it all the easier to just zip through. Other albums can hit me on a deeper emotional level or have even more substance, but this is just fun, and the sheer amount of replayability I got out of it all but guaranteed it a spot on this list. But while we're on the topic of albums capable of doing a lot with very little, number 8. Blank Forms, or blank4.ms, After the Town Was Swept Away. You know, the second I saw this album artwork show up on Bandcamp's New and Notable, it immediately made me want to give it a shot. And it turns out the music lives up to the experience promised by that cover. This is an extremely, low-key, drone and minimal house-adjacent kind of record that tries to go for that Boards of Canada type effect of uncovering bygone faded memories through old, obsolete tech that seems to be breaking down, but still adding up all of its fragments to a resonant and coherent emotional arc loosely inspired by the artist seeing his mother pass away to cancer as well as the birth of his first child. The many pieces here are very fuzzy and indistinct on the surface, may only be some super lo-fi pad drone, or a degraded tape loop, or some thumping beats over some experimental noise, or some minimalistic melodic progressions, but all of them feel very distinct from each other in their simplicity and fit together in their cohesive overarching whole. There's a musical world being built here that you can only see through very specific limited angles that might not seem connected but still make some logical sense fitting together. Not even to mention the couple of extra texture in a few moments from some guest performances of saxophones and vocals and piano to help it even further go the extra mile. This was one of those albums that I couldn't stop thinking about the second I first heard it, and it just keeps enrapturing my attention in a way that few artists with mixes this low key can pull off easily. It's legit started to hit me in a similar way to certain actress projects, and that is not a comparison I can make lightly. And it's kept me in for lots of repeat listens as well, catching up with some of these others near the top, despite me discovering it somewhat later in the year. I don't know if I can fully put it into words, it just has to be heard to be believed. Go check it out. There wasn't any listening experience I had this year quite like it. Number 7. Zircon Arcology. Man, I knew this being the very first major new electronic release I heard this year was a good omen for the state of the genre. I will freely admit to struggling with Arcology a tiny bit upon its initial release, since my expectations for it were so completely over the moon. One of my biggest high school inspirations, Zircon, finally returning to making a full non-soundtrack album for the first time in over a decade, with a sequel to his biggest masterpiece, Identity Sequence. It seemed almost too good to be true. With a bar that high to live up to, and after this long a time out of the game, expecting something as life-changing as Identity Sequence was for me back in the day wouldn't have been reasonable, especially now that I'm entering into my 30s. But now that I've really given it some space away from all those expectations, just taken it for what it is and allowed all these cyberpunk bangers to really sit with me over the course of the year, I have to say, this was still a phenomenal album, able to recapture so much of what I loved about Identity Sequence in its own separate but easily comparable ways. I did already think it was great when I covered it, and it's only grown on me more and more in the time since I put out my video on it. Especially as there's been so much more quality electronic music to compete with it this year, yet this still held up and even made it easier to appreciate the specific niche that only Zircon could possibly fill this well. I think at this point I am ready to say that it did finally get to a level that lived up to the hype I had for it. The tightly structured science fiction concept and story, which might actually play more into the music than Identity Sequence's story did, the variety of styles taking influence from the very best parts of the mid-2010s EDM scene where he originally left off all those years ago, from electro dubstep to drum and bass to hip-hop to some of those not really symphonic, ambient-centric, and more experimental ideas thrown in for flavor. And of course how beautiful Jillian Aversa's vocals still sound and how fantastically nailed all the melodic hooks are. It was a nostalgia bomb so perfectly tuned to the tastes of my 17-year-old self that it could legit make me feel like a teenager again in the best way. Some parts of this can legit get me to tear up now, especially No Limits and Beyond Our Vision. The track Stranger Skies also finally clicked with me a lot more after initially not being as much of a standout for whatever reason. If you're around my age or slightly younger and or have nostalgia for that mid-2010s era of electronic music and the most ambitious stuff people like him were doing around that time, then this is going to be an absolute must-listen. I'm so happy this finally saw the light of day. Number 6. Seeming the World.
You won't have to be brave.
There's a reason I always wait until December 31st to publish my year-end list. And man, do you know you got something truly special when an album can get this high on the list. And not only did it come out in December and give me very little time to let it sit with me, not only did it come from a band who I previously only kind of knew about in passing and only heard for the first time through appearing on one of my favorite tracks on Coma Duster's new album earlier this year, but also it's an EBM / darkwave / industrial adjacent synth pop record. Specific genre niche I can always enjoy, but it's not too often something from that space actually cracks into my regular listening rotation. With Seeming, I felt like I had no choice but to acknowledge how great it was in this video after just 1 or 2 listens. Not only are the melodies and hooks on this thing absolutely knocked out of the park on every single track, not only is the production impressively forceful across the board and sonically varied enough to ensure my attention will never be trailing off, not only is Alex Reed such a commanding vocal presence approaching every track on here with absolute full-hearted sincerity, but what really gets it to go the extra mile is the lyrics, which also aren't something I typically weigh heavily in my enjoyment of albums, you know, being the electronic music guy who listens to mostly instrumental music. But I could not ignore how unbelievably badass the overtly anti-fascist messaging was throughout this album. Trying to inspire people to actively fight the powers that be, acknowledging the dire circumstances the entire world is in, but still striving to find hope for a better future, and getting to that better future by whatever means necessary. This shit was so obviously amazing on the surface that it had to notch a high spot on this list. If Zircon spoke the most to the teenager version of myself, this really spoke to the current 30-year-old version of me, who needed as much light in the seemingly impenetrable darkness that was 2025 as I could get. And boy, what a light this was. Number 5. Turquoise Death, Guardian. And while we're on the topic of artists I'm somewhat late to jump on the bandwagon, I did enjoy the previous 2 Turquoise Death albums from the previous 2 years, Se Bueno and Kaleidoscope. They did provide lots of big, heavy emotional hitters, combining elements of drum and bass, trance, and post-rock, and Kaleidoscope in particular did represent a pretty impressive jump in production quality, though neither of those albums really blew me away in the same way they seemed to for most people I saw at the time. Mostly because I personally found them to run together too much and feel too samey. Both albums could feel longer than they really were. I understood why people loved them, but I was hoping for something that had better structuring and variety. And that is what I got with the finale to this trilogy, Guardian. This is the point at which I felt like Turquoise Death's style finally tapped into its fullest potential. There's only 6 tracks on this thing, but they all have lots of moving parts over lengthy arrangements, and each track feels like it's setting up its own expansive musical environment, connected to but separate from the next one. Tracks like Canyon of Secrets and Voyager get there through evolving drum and bass arrangements, Guardian Surface through airy deep house, and The Looking Glass through classic trance, and sampling Orbital's Halcyon of all things. There's something meant to appeal to me directly if there ever was one. And of course the massive half-hour 5-part suite Close Your Eyes to close the album out, being the most epic and mind-blowing of them all. The first 2 Turquoise Death albums may have been gorgeous too, but this one not only one-ups them by a fairly significant margin just in terms of how easy it is to immerse myself in all of it, but also gives it a constant sense of movement those albums didn't have, so I never felt like I'm just hearing the same thing over and over. 2025 was a blockbuster comeback year for trance music, and there's even more where that came from. But this is some of the very best, most well put together stuff I've heard in this vein in quite a while. It was already great when I first heard it, and it's only gotten better and better the more times I put it on. I imagine this is going to be the #1 album of the year for a lot of other people in the comments of this video, and it'll be deserved. Though, somehow, there were still 4 other albums that spoke to me personally even more and felt like they gave me even more substance, so let's get into those. Number 4. Max Cooper, On Being. Sometimes, though, nothing hits like a good flashy showcase of IDM sound design or some house music that really leans into the more abstract and glitchy side of things. Max Cooper is an artist I've had a bit of a mixed track record with, but man, when his stuff hits, it really freaking hits. And this is probably the album that feels like most indicative of everything his work has been about across his entire career. And, big surprise, it clicked with me even more after I saw him live this year. Seeing his live set progress from like abstract and ambient material first, then like taking more and more structured form, and eventually turning into a more traditional house DJ set by the end. That was a good way to highlight all the different appeals that he's able to hit on as an artist. And this new album is just as much of a demonstration of his multifacetedness. Half the track listing on this thing is big sprawling epics taking either fuzzy ambient drones or simple rival console style minimal house grooves, or both at once, and stuffing loads of interesting glitches and details and cool progressions and twists and turns. And no 2 tracks sound like each other. You can go from glitchy acid techno to guitar and string driven shoegaze inspired drones, to wild experimental bass music, to heartfelt minimal house, to a track that builds from a gazillion layers of spoken word into a big atmospheric drum and bass epic. It's a long album, but there's so much stuff packed into those 75 minutes. I wouldn't say it's my favorite album from him ever when Emergence and Yearning for the Infinite are still there, but it feels the most all-encompassing for his sound, and it is very close behind those two at this point. Once again, it was definitely the kind of thing that kept growing on me the more I put it on, and I unpacked more layers to it. Still, as impressive as this was, it's not the most impressive sound design I heard out of an album this year. That honor goes to number 3, Drum, Under Tangled Silence. As difficult as it was to pin this ranking down, and as much as nearly any of the rankings below this could switch around depending on my mood, I didn't have to think too hard about exactly what my top 3 were going to be. And goddamn, Drum albums may be a rare occurrence, but man does the guy know how to make a new project feel like a big event without even feeling like he's trying that hard. Under Tangled Silence may be his most abstract album yet, and if you're looking for like sticky melodic hooks, you're probably not going to find any here. But what you will find is an absolutely magical blend of fluttery classical and jazz pianos, cinematic pads and violins, embiras and chimes swirling around in super dense and percussion-heavy mixes ranging from UK garage and acid-influenced structures to crazy drum and bass with a couple of small breakbeats to just straight-ahead, high-speed tribal banging. Not to mention every track perfectly segues into the next in a seamless, sort of continuous mix. I can't even really put the experience into words in a way that fully does it justice. I will admit that in terms of replay value, this wasn't among the albums I came back to the most frequently this year, though I would not be able to tell you why, since it kind of floored me anytime I would actually put it on and leave me wondering why I wasn't putting it on more. It's not a 9 out of 10 yet, but I could see a point in the future where it eventually becomes one. If all the praise from other professional outlets outside of this platform hasn't convinced you to hear it yet, then it should go without saying that it's essential listening. But my top 2 happen to get to me on a much more personal level than this, so let's get to those. Number 2. John Tejada, The Watchline. I may have enjoyed lots of John Tejada's work in the past. Guy's always reliably put out lots of well-crafted and easy-to-like traditional techno records, and kept evolving his sound in that space. But I think it's fair to say that I absolutely was not expecting him to put out something that would end up this high on a list like this. Combining his usual sound with some of the shoegaze and synth-pop influences he'd been exploring through his side project band Optometry with Mark Edstrom, along with some light IDM, hip-hop, and breakbeat elements in parts, resulted in an album that's just as foggy, hazy, and emotionally ambiguous as its album cover. And not only did he nail the absolute perfect balance of tracks being varied in their sonic approach with no redundancy in the track listing, while also making sure every track felt like they fit together in a cohesive whole greater than the sum of its parts. Not only did he deliver some of the most sophisticated yet still sticky and memorable tunes he's ever come up with, but this also ended up being more of a perfect match for my general mood throughout 2025 than any other album that came out this year. Evoking the feeling of being stranded and lost, waiting for some kind of hope to arrive, that hope never quite arriving yet, but you still keep watching for it. You still keep surviving to see another day. And you wouldn't think an album this hazy and gray in its tone would be able to hit such a big emotional note, but it absolutely did, at least for me. At no point in 2025 did I ever feel like I was alone in feeling the way I did about the state of the world at large, but the Watchline in its own vague way felt like it was extending some real sympathy and making me feel seen. I would get it if some people heard it and didn't get why it hit me as hard as it did, but this was an album that really got to me on a personal level, and I didn't realize I needed as badly as I did until I heard it. And once I heard it for the first time, I couldn't stop listening to it. I stand by it quite possibly being the best album John Tejada has put out to date, and this guy's been regularly putting out albums since like the end of the 90s, so that is saying something. But speaking of albums that got to me on a really personal level, that takes us to my number 1 pick. There were so many different albums covering so many different niches this year. But my favorite album of the year wasn't some, like, unsung masterwork of sound design or some super underground, undiscovered gem. No, it turns out the album that hit the most for me in 2025 was just a plain old commercial trance album. Number 1. Factor B and Highlander, Bloom in Loving Memory.
Leaves fall to the ground, the harder it rains, the deeper I drown.
Okay, so first off, it's almost easy to forget, but it was literally just the end of last year when I was talking about how badly I missed the entire genre of trance music. I was willing to give an honorable mention on my year-end list in 2024 to a pretty solid Luttrell album that I've barely thought about since, because it was the closest I was getting to real trance in what felt like forever. That now seems quaint after we've gotten not only this Factor B thing, but strong comebacks from Solarstone and Paul Van Dyk and Faithless. Even artists not necessarily known for trance like Tourists decided to make some trance this year. The full-on comeback for this genre has been great to watch. Trance fans have been eating better than they have in years, and this having helped break that drought gave it even more of a boost than it would have gotten otherwise. But even with that in mind, none of these trance comebacks made quite the impact on me that Factor B did this year. 2025 really has been the year of albums that really only clicked with me as something truly special after I already reviewed them. And I did already score this album a solid 8 when I covered it. I knew it was going to be a keeper. But now at the end of the year, I have no trouble calling this a 9 out of 10 and a possible all-timer for me. These tunes are so memorable and personally affecting that I already feel like I have known all these songs my entire life. Mind you, I do still technically stand by the criticisms I gave in my initial review, and I know it's not going to be an easy album to recommend to everyone as a result. It is over 2 hours long, and there's very little variety. Technically, there's an attempt at like staggering the album in two parts, with the second half credited to Factor B being entirely made of just super straightforward traditional trance bangers, while the first half is credited to Factor B's experimental side alias Highlander, which is not really experimental at all. It just means there's more breakbeats and it's not as high energy, and that's kind of it. It's still trance, just not as strict about sticking to the traditional formula. So yeah, if this was way too much for some people or it simply wasn't to their taste, I would totally get it. 2 hours of commercial trance is absolutely not going to be for everyone. Though even with the obvious issues of the length and sameness in mind, these just aren't really issues for me anymore. I can listen to this whole thing in one sitting, all 2 hours of it, and I will love every second of it without ever getting bored. And that includes all the repeat tracks. The fact that there are 4 different tracks that each have 2 different versions included on this album. Like they each have one version for Highlander and one version for Factor B. These don't even feel redundant to me either. It hits me the exact same way as Robert Miles including 2 different versions each of the tracks Children and Fable on Dreamland. Having both versions of both tracks there are nothing but a direct benefit to each other, and that's exactly as true for the doubling up on this album. I mean, the track Echoes from a Past Life even goes the extra mile by putting both of its 2 versions back to back and, like, making one version act as a build-up and the other as a drop, which was really clever. But while I'm on the topic of Dreamland, this is probably the most any album has ever directly recaptured the specific appeal of that album for me. After Robert Miles passed away in 2017, Dreamland irreversibly turned into an album directly about coming to terms with death for me, and it subsequently rose up to one of my very favorite albums of all time in any genre. This album may not have the same kind of teenager nostalgia, obviously, but it hits on the same kind of note, and on purpose. Being about death and coming to terms with it was very much the entire goal from the outset here. This stuff came directly off the heels of Factor B not only losing his mother to cancer, but also his wife. This man lost the 2 people closest to him in the span of just over a year, and everything on the album is directly informed by the insane level of grief he went through in such a way that only a genre as frequently over-the-top emotional as trance music can truly capture. Other albums on this list may have gotten me to tear up, but Bloom in Loving Memory made me cry. A lot. Over the course of this year. Even all the corniest and most simplistic affirmations feel like they carry so much weight. And in a year where, just in the world at large, it feels like we're constantly losing so much, people dying in genocides, the very planet we live on being slowly killed in the name of profit and billionaires' egos, an album that tries this hard to process an incomparable amount of grief and counteracts it with as much joy, empathy, and love for those we can no longer reach as it can. Yeah. I have no words for just how damn much I needed this. I don't know if this is going to be the kind of trick that Factor B will ever be able to pull in the same way again, but this is an album that's going to be sticking with me forever. Without question, my favorite album of 2025. And that is the list. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next year.